December 1941. The Pacific horizon shimmered under the early morning sun, a dazzling line of gold and blue stretching endlessly. Japanese reconnaissance pilots sliced through the sky, scanning the waters below, confident that they would find only scattered enemy supply ships. Small fleets, nothing that could challenge their precision strike. Then, through the glare of the rising sun, something impossible appeared. At first it seemed like a mirage, dark shapes rising above the waves, massive decks glittering with metal. As they drew closer, the full scale became horrifyingly clear. These were not ordinary ships. These were floating fortresses, bristling with anti-aircraft guns, catapults, and rows upon rows of planes perched like predators ready to strike. The pilots radioed frantic reports. Enemy carriers, multiple, too many, moving in formation. The sun reflected off steel like fire on the waves. Each carrier seemed more like an unsinkable island than a vessel of war. Aircraft lined the decks, their wings cutting sharp shadows across the metal, engines ready for launch. Every gun barrel, every turret glinted in the morning light, an unblinking sentinel over the Pacific. The Japanese pilots, skilled in aerial tactics, were suddenly struck by a deep unease. How had these ships gone unnoticed? How could so many enormous vessels exist where reconnaissance had reported nothing? Panic and disbelief coursed through their formations. Reports collided over the radio, warnings shouted and repeated. There's a wall of steel. Advancing, we can't get through. For the first time, they felt the raw weight of uncertainty, the sensation that the very ocean they thought they dominated had been claimed by something they could barely comprehend. These fortress carriers were more than mere ships. They were strategic marvels, mobile air bases capable of projecting power across hundreds of miles. To the Japanese pilots, each deck was a mystery, each silhouette a riddle. How could the Americans conceal such strength? How had these massive fortresses avoided detection while shifting the balance of naval power in secret? The ocean itself seemed smaller, constrained by these moving citadels, each one a guardian of the sea. The pilots realized they were facing a foe who had rewritten the rules of engagement before a single shot had been fired. Every instinct honed through years of training warned them. This was unlike anything they had encountered. And yet, the full story of these carriers, how they were designed, built, and hidden, how they became the backbone of an unseen strategy, was a tale that stretched back years before this shocking morning. To understand this wall of steel, to truly grasp the shock that rippled through those Japanese reconnaissance pilots, we have to go back to the decisions, the innovations, and the secrets that created the Pacific's most formidable fleet. Long before the first shots rang out in the Pacific, the world's navies were obsessed with steel and firepower. Battleships, with their towering turrets and thick armor, were seen as the ultimate arbiters of sea power. For decades, naval strategy revolved around these floating fortresses, their might unquestioned, their dominance assumed. Yet beneath this veneer of certainty, a quiet revolution was taking shape, one that would redefine naval warfare forever. World War I offered the first hint. Airplanes, once fragile and experimental, began to show potential as weapons of war. They could scout, they could strike, and they could change the flow of a battle in ways no battleship ever could. Admirals took notice, and the concept of the aircraft carrier, an entire fleet floating on wings, emerged from the drawing boards of visionaries who dared to imagine a new kind of naval dominance. By the 1930s, Japan had embraced this vision with remarkable foresight. The Kaga and Akagi, followed by the Shokaku and Zuikaku, were more than just ships. They were symbols of an ambitious strategy. Sleek, fast, and capable of launching waves of aircraft with deadly precision, these carriers allowed Japan to strike across vast distances, projecting power far beyond the range of traditional guns. To the world, they were proof that the era of the battleship was waning, and a new age of naval aviation was dawning. America, however, was not far behind. The industrial heart of the nation churned relentlessly, turning ideas into prototypes and experiments into functional machines. Carrier designs were tested and refined at a pace unmatched by any other navy. From modest beginnings with Lexington and Saratoga to the bold innovations of the Yorktown class, the United States was quietly building a fleet that would soon dominate the Pacific. Engineers experimented with deck layouts, catapult systems, and flight operations, searching for the perfect balance between offense and defense, mobility and firepower. Yet there was a critical difference between Japan and the United States. Japan's carriers were lean, fast, and offensive-minded, designed to strike decisively before the enemy could react. The Americans were thinking ahead, planning for a conflict that would test endurance, resilience, and industrial might. In hidden shipyards and testing bays, they explored something radical. Carriers that could not only launch planes but withstand attacks, shield their air wings, and become moving fortresses on the ocean. This quiet innovation went largely unnoticed by Japanese planners. To them, the war in the Pacific would be decided by daring strikes and tactical brilliance. They had no reason to suspect that the Americans were crafting vessels that would change the very nature of naval combat. Ships that were not just carriers, but fortified bastions. Mobile citadels designed to absorb punishment while projecting overwhelming air power. As the Japanese pilots would soon discover, these carriers were not ordinary airstrips at sea. They were a new kind of weapon, combining the mobility of a ship with the fortification of a fortress. Each deck, each armored hangar, each anti-aircraft emplacement was calculated to survive, to endure, to dominate. And among these floating airstrips, one design stood apart: massive, fortified carriers that looked nothing like the rest. Ships that would shock the enemy and reshape the Pacific War before a single bomb had fallen. By the early 1940s, the U.S. Navy faced a stark reality. The Pacific was vast, unpredictable, and lethal. Aircraft carriers could no longer be fragile platforms for launching planes. They had to survive. The philosophy was simple, yet revolutionary. A carrier's true value was not only in the planes it launched, but in its ability to endure the storm of war. Armor, anti-aircraft guns, and layered defenses became as important as speed or offensive reach. This mindset gave birth to the Essex-class carriers, a fleet designed for resilience on a scale never before seen. Unlike previous carriers, these ships were built with reinforced hulls, armored flight decks, and redundant systems to absorb damage and keep fighting. Hangars were compartmentalized to limit fires, elevators were armored to protect planes below, and anti-aircraft batteries bristled along every edge of the deck. Each ship was effectively a fortress at sea, capable of projecting power while shrugging off the fury of enemy attacks. Innovation extended beyond brute strength. Engineers studied every vulnerability, every past loss, and asked a single question: how can a carrier survive a barrage and still return fire? The answer lay in integrating defense into every element of the ship. Radar systems, fighter direction centers, and coordinated anti-aircraft fire created a network of protection that turned the carrier into a mobile bastion. These were not just ships. They were floating citadels, designed to endure the chaos of the Pacific while keeping their deadly air wings operational. Across the ocean, Japan pursued a different philosophy. The Kaga, Akagi, and their sisters emphasized speed, striking power, and maneuverability. Lightly armored and built for rapid offensive strikes, they could launch waves of aircraft faster than the enemy could respond. But their defenses were limited, their decks vulnerable, and their hulls unable to absorb sustained punishment. Japanese carriers were weapons of lightning, powerful in the short term, brilliant in surprise, but they carried a hidden fragility that would soon be brutally exposed. This divergence in design philosophy set the stage for a collision of extremes: speed and agility versus armor and resilience. It was a clash not just of fleets but of ideas, a duel between those who trusted audacity and those who relied on preparation and endurance. Each approach had strengths, but only one would survive repeated encounters across the unforgiving expanse of the Pacific. By late 1941, these fortress carriers were nearing operational readiness. They had not yet fired a shot in anger, but their presence was quietly reshaping the battlefield. Every design choice, every layer of armor, every battery of guns reflected lessons learned from previous naval conflicts and the anticipation of a war that would test every assumption about naval power. And then it happened. Japanese pilots, flying high and confident, finally encountered them. The sight was unlike anything they had imagined. Hulls bristling with guns, armored decks impervious to their standard bombs, a floating fortress blocking their advance. Shock rippled through their formations. Their weapons, once deadly and reliable, now seemed almost useless against this new breed of carrier. The stage was set for a confrontation that would redefine naval warfare, and for the pilots witnessing this armored behemoth for the first time, the reality was terrifying. By 1944, Japan faced a grim reality. Resources were dwindling, industrial output was faltering, and the once mighty fleet that had dominated the Pacific was steadily losing ground. Desperation gave birth to radical measures, and among them, one tactic would come to define the darkest hours of the Pacific War: kamikaze attacks. Young pilots, often barely trained, volunteered for missions with a single goal: to crash their planes into American ships and deliver destruction in a single, suicidal strike. The strategy was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. Japanese commanders believed that concentrated attacks against the relatively lightly armored decks of American carriers would cripple them quickly. Each plane was a guided missile, loaded with explosives, fuel, and the will to die. Carriers, they assumed, would burn, sink, or be forced out of the fight, clearing the way for Japanese dominance once more. For the pilots, every sortie was both an act of faith and a test of courage, a final gamble against an enemy whose strength seemed insurmountable. From above, the carriers appeared vulnerable. Flat, sprawling decks could be set ablaze by a single well-placed strike. Japanese command calculated that speed, surprise, and sheer determination would pierce the defenses that had frustrated them in earlier encounters. The kamikaze was not merely a weapon. It was a psychological hammer, designed to break both ship and spirit. Yet what the Japanese failed to grasp was the evolution of the fortress carrier concept. The Essex class and other heavily fortified carriers were not designed for mere survival. They were designed to endure, to absorb punishment, and to keep fighting when all seemed lost. Anti-aircraft guns roared to life, creating a wall of fire that shredded incoming planes before they could reach their target. Armored flight decks resisted explosions that would have torn conventional carriers apart. An internal compartmentalization contained fires and limited structural damage. When kamikazes struck, the results were often startling. Explosions erupted across decks, smoke and debris filled the air. But the carriers kept moving, their aircraft still launching, their mission undisturbed. Pilots who had trained for precision bombing found their weapons almost impotent against ships built to survive. Each impact that failed to cripple a carrier deepened the shock and frustration of the Japanese airmen, who had expected their desperate gambit to succeed. The fortress carriers were more than ships. They were statements. They embodied resilience, industrial might, and the lessons of a navy that had anticipated the most extreme threats. The kamikaze pilots, once confident in their destructive potential, faced an enemy that refused to break. Each attack revealed not weakness but astonishing endurance, a refusal to yield even in the face of self-sacrifice designed to destroy them. And so, when the Japanese launched their most determined kamikaze assaults, they encountered a truth that would haunt their strategists. The fortress carriers absorbed these blows in ways the Japanese never anticipated, turning desperation into futility and redefining the calculus of naval warfare in the Pacific. June 19, 1944. The Pacific sky burned with the roar of engines and the thunder of anti-aircraft guns. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had begun, a clash that would earn the grim nickname, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese pilots, trained for precision and speed, dove from the clouds, their bombs poised to strike at the heart of the American fleet. They expected devastation. Instead, they encountered a revelation. The fortress carriers seemed almost impervious. From above, the Essex-class carriers appeared as islands of steel, bristling with firepower. Japanese pilots swooped in, release mechanisms clicking only to see bombs strike armored decks and fail to penetrate. Explosions were contained, fires extinguished before spreading, and the carriers continued their mission, launching wave after wave of fighter planes to intercept attackers. Pilots reported back in disbelief. They would not die. No matter what we threw at them, they kept moving, kept fighting. Months later, in October 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf tested these floating fortresses in a new way. Japanese pilots, desperate and emboldened, launched coordinated attacks from multiple directions, hoping to overwhelm the fleet. Kamikaze strikes, dive bombers, and torpedo planes converged in a symphony of chaos. From the bridge to the hangars, American crews moved with trained precision, extinguishing fires, repairing damage, and countering attacks with a relentless hail of anti-aircraft fire. The carriers absorbed hit after hit, some suffering dozens of direct strikes, yet still remaining afloat, still striking back. Eyewitness accounts tell a story that seems almost mythical. Pilots described carriers taking flames across the deck, yet continuing to launch aircraft. Torpedoes hit hulls that flexed but did not break. Bombs that should have crippled the engines were absorbed or contained, and within hours, repair crews had restored flight operations. The carriers were not just surviving, they were dominating the battlefield while their attackers were forced to retreat, broken in spirit and depleted in numbers. These engagements revealed more than physical resilience. They showcased a psychological advantage. Japanese pilots expecting quick victory were confronted with the impossible, an enemy that refused to die. Every failed attack eroded morale, sowed confusion, and amplified the shock that had begun months earlier when the first fortress carriers appeared on the horizon. Reports flooded back to command centers, each message echoing disbelief. They are like fortresses. They will not sink. They cannot be stopped. The contrast with Japanese carriers could not have been starker. Ships built for speed and agility might strike hard, but the Essex-class carriers struck back while enduring punishment that would have sunk any conventional vessel. Each engagement reinforced the lesson of preparation, engineering, and foresight. In war, endurance could outweigh aggression, and a well-protected fleet could absorb desperation and convert it into strategic dominance. Yet even these fortified giants had limits. Some carriers would take dozens of hits, fires raging across decks, systems failing, structural damage threatening stability, and still, against all odds, they returned to battle. The question that haunted both sides lingered over every encounter. Just how indestructible were these carriers? And how far could their resilience be tested before the ocean finally claimed them? March 19, 1945. The USS Franklin, steaming through the waters off Japan, suddenly became a battlefield in itself. A bomb from a kamikaze strike tore through her flight deck, triggering explosions that ripped apart aircraft, fuel lines, and living quarters. Flames surged skyward, consuming everything in their path, smoke choking the air, metal twisting under the heat. And yet, against all odds, Franklin did not sink. Below decks, sailors moved with a single, unyielding purpose. Firefighting teams battled infernos with hoses and buckets, plugging holes and sealing bulkheads while explosions continued to rock the ship. Medics tended to the wounded amid falling debris. Pilots and deck crews worked to launch what planes they could, maintaining the ship's offensive capacity even as flames licked at their heels. Every action was a testament not only to training, but to a sheer will to survive. Similarly, the USS Bunker Hill faced its own trial in May 1945. 2 kamikaze hits in rapid succession ripped through her decks. Fires exploded in waves, smoke obscuring vision, and aircraft stores ignited like kindling. Sailors were thrown to the deck, injured, even killed, but the ship refused to yield. Crews improvised, rigging hoses from every source, forming human chains to fight flames and save critical systems. Slowly, methodically, they wrested control from chaos, proving that courage could match steel, and that human resilience could turn a floating fortress into an unbreakable bastion. And then there was the USS Enterprise, a carrier that had faced relentless assaults throughout the war. She endured torpedo strikes, bombings, and kamikaze attacks, each one threatening catastrophic loss. Yet her armored decks, reinforced hangars, and layered defenses, combined with disciplined crews, kept her operational. Every crew member knew the stakes: the lives of comrades, the outcome of the Pacific Campaign. The very survival of the fleet depended on their resolve. Enterprise became more than a ship. She became a symbol of endurance, a testament to the synergy of human will and engineering foresight. These dramatic encounters reveal a profound truth. It was not just steel that defined the fortress carriers, but the people within them. Sailors, working tirelessly under unimaginable pressure, transformed potential catastrophe into continued strength. Every fire fought, every hole patched, every plane launched amidst chaos was a statement. These carriers would not die, because those aboard refused to let them. For Japanese commanders watching from afar, these stories were terrifying. Plan after plan to cripple the fleet ended in failure. They had expected ships to burn, to sink, to be removed from the fight. But each tale of survival deepened a grim realization. The carrier's resilience was more than armor and guns. It was courage, ingenuity, and unrelenting determination. By the time the smoke cleared and the seas calmed, one truth had become undeniable. The fortress carriers had not only survived, they had proven that against even the most desperate tactics they could endure. And for Japanese commanders, this resilience forced a haunting realization: the war at sea, no matter the sacrifice, was unwinnable. From high above the Pacific, Japanese pilots peered down at what should have been easy targets. Instead, they saw something that defied every expectation: vast armored carriers, their decks bristling with guns, launching planes even as bombs fell around them. Radio reports crackled through the formations, disbelief lacing every word. They won't go down. They're still launching planes, floating fortresses, For young aviators trained for precision strikes and decisive victories, the psychological impact was immediate. Missions designed to break the American fleet quickly became exercises in futility. Kamikaze pilots, once emboldened by doctrine and honor, now faced a creeping dread. Their sacrifices often failed to achieve their goal. Bombs bounced off armored decks, fires were contained, and the carriers pressed forward as if untouched by the onslaught. This was a stark contrast to the early days of the war. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese pilots had executed a flawless, devastating strike. Battleships burned, ports were destroyed, and the sense of invincibility coursed through the Imperial Navy. The psychology of victory was intoxicating, reinforcing the belief that skill, speed, and audacity could win the day. Yet as the war dragged on and engagements in the Marianas and Leyte unfolded, that confidence eroded. Hopelessness crept into the cockpit. Pilots flew again and again, only to watch the fortress carriers shrug off damage that should have crippled lesser ships. Each mission reinforced the same grim truth. They were up against an enemy that had anticipated their every tactic, that had built ships to endure the very attacks Japan considered decisive. Exhaustion, frustration, and fear mixed with the adrenaline of combat, creating a psychological toll that no training could prepare them for. Reports from surviving pilots tell a haunting story. One radio transmission described a dive bomber striking a carrier with a direct hit, only to see the deck remain intact and aircraft on launch pads continue their mission. Another recalled a kamikaze's impact that ignited massive fires, yet the ship kept moving, guns firing, planes taking off. Over time, these encounters accumulated in memory like weights in the cockpit, eroding morale and fostering a deep sense of inevitability. The realization was sobering. The war they had imagined, swift and decisive, was no longer possible. The carriers were more than ships. They were symbols of something far larger. America's industrial might, its ability to design, build, and repair fleets at a scale Japan could not match, was embodied in these floating fortresses. Each carrier was a testament to resilience, ingenuity, and the relentless production that kept planes flying, guns firing, and crews surviving against impossible odds. And the shock only grew when Japan realized what these ships truly represented. Not just defensive marvels, not just tactical victories at sea, but the unstoppable engine of American industrial power. An ocean-spanning force that could absorb loss, rebuild faster than it could be destroyed, and turn every desperate strike into a lesson in futility. By 1942, a quiet but unstoppable force was shaping the Pacific War, American industry. While Japanese planners relied on precision, skill, and daring tactics, the United States leaned on something far more relentless, a machine of production capable of replacing loss faster than the enemy could strike. Carriers, the backbone of the Pacific Campaign, became the most visible testament to this industrial might. Japan had launched 25 carriers over the course of the war, each a triumph of engineering and tactical planning. Yet their losses were permanent. When a ship went down, there was no replacement, no reinforcements ready to step into the breach. Every sunk vessel represented a strategic setback that could not easily be recovered. The United States approached the conflict differently. From the shipyards of Newport News to the bustling docks of Puget Sound, a vast coordinated industrial engine churned day and night. Designs were standardized, production scaled, and lessons from each engagement integrated into the next batch of ships. By war's end, the U.S. had launched more than 100 carriers, each one larger, tougher, and more advanced than the last. Fortress carriers, bristling with armor and anti-aircraft fire, became a symbol not just of technological achievement, but of a system that could turn attrition into advantage. The numbers alone told a story Japan could not ignore. Even if a dozen carriers were lost in a single battle, a dozen more were already underway, their construction overseen by thousands of engineers, shipbuilders, and laborers working tirelessly. The calculation was staggering. While Japan gambled on naval supremacy and singular victories, the U.S. relied on sheer endurance and capacity. The carriers were living proof that in total war, industrial scale could be as decisive as tactics, as enduring as courage. These fortress carriers were more than floating airstrips. They were monuments to the American ability to plan, adapt, and sustain. Each ship represented not just steel and guns, but a society mobilized, an economy harnessed to the demands of conflict, and a vision of warfare where resilience could outmatch audacity. They embodied the philosophy that survival and adaptability mattered as much as aggression, and that a nation capable of producing more, faster and better could redefine the battlefield itself. For Japanese strategists, the reality was stark and terrifying. The empire had gambled everything on naval supremacy, counting on skill, surprise, and sacrifice to achieve decisive victories. But the fortress carriers were more than opponents. They were a wall that could not be broken. A relentless reminder that industrial power and foresight could withstand even the most desperate tactics. And as the Japanese fleet reeled from this sobering truth, one question loomed over the Pacific. How could an empire, no matter how daring, overcome an opponent whose strength was as much in its factories as in its ships? The answer would shape the remainder of the war and the fate of the empire itself. Spring, 1945. The Pacific burned with the fury of battles that would become legends. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, names carved into the memory of war. For the men who fought there, the ocean was no longer a barrier but a battlefield, and at the center of it all stood the fortress carriers. Wave after wave of Japanese kamikaze pilots hurled themselves at the American fleet. Engines screamed, bombs armed, wings trembling as they dove toward their targets with desperate precision. The sky itself seemed alive with fire, anti-aircraft tracers clawing upward, explosions ripping through the air, aircraft spiraling in smoke and flame. Yet through this storm of sacrifice and destruction, the fortress carriers endured. Some were struck, decks torn, steel scorched, crews thrown from their posts, but the armored flight decks held. Fires that might have consumed other carriers were contained, sealed off by watertight compartments, beaten back by sailors who refused to abandon their stations. Within hours, flight operations resumed. Planes launched from decks still smoldering, their engines roaring into the sky, carrying the fight deeper into Japanese territory. For the kamikazes, the cost was staggering. Hundreds of planes and the young men within them vanished into fire and steel, achieving little more than scars across the armor of the American fleet. Their sacrifice was immense, but the outcome was unchanged. The carriers pressed forward, relentless, unbreakable. By Okinawa, the scale of the struggle was almost beyond comprehension. The Japanese launched massed waves of suicide attacks, the largest in the entire war, hoping to bleed the Americans so heavily that invasion would become impossible. But the fortress carriers, supported by screens of destroyers and cruisers, weathered the storm. Each new strike only confirmed what Japanese commanders already feared. Their air power was gone, their naval aviation shattered beyond repair. The once proud Japanese carrier fleet, which had dominated the Pacific in the opening months of the war, was now a ghost. Akagi, Kaga, Zuikaku, Shokaku, names that had once struck fear were gone, claimed by battles long past. By 1945, Japan had no carriers left worthy of the fight. Their replacements were incomplete, their fuel supplies exhausted, their pilots inexperienced. The Imperial Navy had gambled everything on speed, precision, and surprise, and lost. In their place stood the Essex class, the indomitable fortress carriers, driving ever closer to the Japanese homeland. With each island secured, they brought the bombers within range, B-29s rising from captured runways, escorted by fighters that launched from armored decks at sea. Step by step, the noose tightened. Japan's oceans, once a shield, had become a cage. And still, the shock of those first sightings lingered. For the young kamikaze pilots who dove toward steel walls and survived only in memory. For the commanders who watched their reports and realized their empire's fate was sealed. The fortress carriers had become more than ships. They were symbols of endurance, of industrial might, of a future Japan could not match. And so, in the dying days of the war, as Japan braced for the inevitable, one image defined the end: vast, armored decks stretching across the horizon, planes rising in endless waves, fleets advancing like floating cities. The shock Japanese pilots had felt on that first morning was now something larger, something inescapable. The war in the Pacific ended in flames and silence. But even as the guns went quiet, one truth endured. The fortress carriers had reshaped naval warfare forever. For centuries, sea power had meant battleships, floating citadels armed with colossal guns, symbols of national pride. At Pearl Harbor, that myth was shattered, and by the war's end it was buried for good. The fortress carriers proved that air power, not artillery, would dominate the oceans. They were not simply ships, they were mobile airfields, striking with reach and resilience no battleship could match. Their influence rippled into the Cold War. The United States Navy, backed by its industrial base, expanded the fortress carrier concept into a global tool of power projection. Carriers became symbols not just of warfighting capacity, but of diplomacy, floating reminders that America could send its strength to any horizon. Britain, bloodied by the war and burdened by austerity, still recognized the lesson. The Royal Navy launched its own armored carriers, inspired by the resilience of American designs. Across the world, navies studied the battles of Leyte Gulf, Okinawa, and the Philippine Sea, searching for answers to the same question. How do you stop a ship that can survive the very attacks meant to destroy it? Even the Soviet Union, building fleets in a different age, could not ignore the carrier's dominance. Submarines, missiles, and air wings, all were designed with one goal in mind: to counter or contain the fortress carriers that patrolled the seas like steel guardians of an emerging order. But their legacy was more than technological. It was philosophical. The clash between Japanese and American carriers had been more than a contest of ships. It was a duel of strategies, of societies, of visions of war itself. Japan had built for audacity, sleek, fast vessels meant to win through bold strikes and decisive battles. The United States had built for endurance, armored decks, redundant systems, repair crews ready to fight shipboard infernos as fiercely as any pilot fought in the skies. In the end, endurance prevailed. Industrial might and design foresight combined to create carriers that could absorb the most desperate assaults and still launch wave after wave of planes. It was not brilliance in a single battle that doomed Japan, but the relentless realization that no matter how fiercely they struck, the fortress carriers endured and returned fire. For the Japanese pilots who first glimpsed them, the memory never faded. Dark silhouettes rising against the Pacific dawn, bristling with guns, their armored decks gleaming in the light. To those men, the fortress carriers were more than ships. They were inevitability made steel. Imagine their final view, diving through smoke and flak, the ocean blazing beneath. And there ahead, colossal decks unbroken, planes still launching, the fortress carriers pressing forward as if nothing could halt their advance. That image became the war's closing truth. Not courage, not sacrifice, not even the ultimate weapon of self-destruction could stop the fleet that carried its own fortress across the sea. And so, history remembers the lesson not in the flames of kamikazes, but in the resilience of steel and the endurance of men.